A work-obsessed, single-dad billionaire CEO barely notices his teenage daughter. But one night, coming home late from work, he goes up to her room and immediately falls to his knees, frozen in horror at what he sees. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Tristan Langley had built an empire from the ground up, a tech conglomerate that dominated industries, shattered records, and secured his name among the wealthiest men in the world. He was a visionary, a man of discipline, and someone who thrived in the high-stakes world of billion-dollar deals. To the outside world, he was untouchable, an icon of success, of hard work paying off. But inside his sprawling penthouse, beyond the glimmering city skyline and the sterile modernity of his designer home, something was missing. Something he had convinced himself he was providing all along. Emily, his 16-year-old daughter, was the only family he had left. His wife had walked away years ago, unable to compete with his ambition, unwilling to remain in a marriage where she was more of an accessory than a partner. Emily had stayed with him, but over time, he had come to treat their relationship much the same way he treated his business: detached, pragmatic, efficient. She had a trust fund that ensured she would never struggle, a credit card with no spending limit, a private school education among the children of elites. From Tristan's perspective, he had given her everything she could possibly need. But Emily didn't need any of it. She needed him. The signs had been there, but Tristan had always been too distracted, too busy, to notice them. The way she lingered at the dinner table just a little too long, waiting for a conversation that never came. The times she hesitated at his office door before silently turning away. The nights she sat alone in the cavernous penthouse, flipping through childhood photos on her phone, remembering a time when her father used to lift her onto his shoulders, when he used to read her bedtime stories, when he used to look at her instead of through her. Tristan barely noticed how distant she had become. In his mind, Emily was just going through the usual teenage phases: mood swings, rebellion, isolation. He had grown accustomed to her quiet presence, to her absence at the breakfast table, to the one-word responses she gave when he occasionally asked about school. He assumed she was fine. She had everything, didn't she? That night, he arrived home later than usual. It had been a long day at the office, filled with meetings, negotiations, and a press conference that had gone longer than expected. His mind was still tangled in the intricacies of his latest merger, the numbers spinning in his head even as the elevator carried him up to the top floor of his penthouse. The doors slid open, and he stepped into the dimly lit space, the cold silence greeting him as it always did. He set his briefcase down, loosened his tie, and poured himself a drink. Usually, that was the extent of his routine before heading straight to bed, but for some reason, something gnawed at him tonight. Maybe it was the way the silence felt heavier, the way the penthouse seemed emptier than usual. He glanced at the sleek, modern clock on the wall. It was past midnight. He hadn't seen Emily all day, not that this was unusual. But something about it unsettled him. For the first time in months, he decided to check on her. Tristan walked down the long hallway, his footsteps muffled against the polished hardwood floors. He realized then that he couldn't remember the last time he had been inside her room. When she was little, he used to tuck her in every night, tell her stories, kiss her forehead and promise to see her in the morning. Somewhere along the way, those nights had stopped. Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that she had outgrown needing him. He reached her door and knocked lightly. No answer. He pushed it open. At first, it didn't register. The dim glow of her bedside lamp cast soft shadows across the room, illuminating the mess of papers scattered on her desk, the half-empty glass of water on her nightstand, the unmade bed. It was when his eyes landed on her still form that the breath in his lungs vanished. Emily was sprawled across the bed, motionless, her face pale, her lips slightly parted. Scattered across the sheets were empty pill bottles, their caps lying haphazardly beside them. The glass slipped from Tristan's fingers and shattered against the floor. For a moment, the world around him collapsed. His knees buckled, and he stumbled forward, reaching for her, shaking her limp shoulders with hands that trembled so violently he could barely control them. "Emily!" His voice cracked, raw and panicked. "Emily, wake up! Baby, wake up!" She didn't move. Tristan's hands fumbled for his phone, his fingers clumsy, shaking as he dialed emergency services. His voice was barely coherent as he gave them the address, as he begged them to hurry, as he pressed his ear against Emily's chest, searching for a heartbeat, for any sign that she was still here, that he wasn't too late. Minutes stretched into eternity. He didn't realize he was crying until he felt the wetness streaking down his face. His daughter, his baby girl, was slipping through his fingers, and he had never even seen it coming. He had never asked the right questions. He had never been there when it mattered. And now, he might never get the chance to fix it. The sound of sirens cut through the night. The paramedics stormed in, their voices urgent, their movements precise as they worked over Emily's fragile body. Tristan stood frozen, watching helplessly as they checked her vitals, as they loaded her onto a stretcher, as they rushed her toward the ambulance. "Is she breathing?" Tristan's voice was barely above a whisper, his throat raw. "She has a pulse," one of the paramedics said, but their tone was cautious. "But it's weak." Tristan followed them, his own legs barely carrying him. He climbed into the ambulance, gripping Emily's hand in his own, feeling how small and cold it was. His mind raced through every moment he had wasted, every birthday he had missed, every time he had chosen work over her. He had spent his entire life building an empire, believing that money, that success, that power were the things that mattered most. But none of it meant anything now. None of it could help him fix this. For the first time in years, Tristan Langley prayed. He prayed that it wasn't too late. The ambulance ride felt like it lasted both seconds and an eternity. Tristan sat rigidly beside Emily, his hand wrapped around hers, barely breathing as the paramedics worked around them. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off his haunted expression, but his mind was blank, stuck in a looping nightmare of what-ifs. The entire time, his grip on Emily's cold, limp hand never loosened. He had always thought of himself as a man in control, someone who dictated his own fate, who made things happen rather than waiting for them. But now, he was nothing more than a powerless father, clutching onto the one thing that mattered as it slipped through his fingers. The moment they burst through the emergency room doors, chaos erupted around him. Nurses and doctors swarmed, their voices sharp and urgent as they called out orders, moving Emily onto a gurney and rushing her away before he had the chance to process it. He stumbled forward, trying to follow, but a nurse placed a firm hand on his chest, stopping him. "Sir, you need to wait here." Tristan blinked at her, his breath uneven, his pulse hammering in his ears. "But they're doing everything they can. Please let them work." He nodded stiffly, though the motion felt unnatural. Then he was alone. The waiting room was nothing more than a blur of sterile white walls and hushed voices. He sat hunched forward, his hands clasped together, his fingers gripping each other tightly enough to leave bruises. The minutes dragged into hours, stretching endlessly as he stared at the doors Emily had disappeared behind. His mind refused to be silent. He could still see her lifeless body on the bed, the way her chest barely moved, the way her skin had lost its color. He should have seen this coming. He should have known. How many times had she reached for him without words, only for him to brush her aside, too busy, too distracted, too blind? The doors finally swung open, and Tristan shot to his feet. A doctor, clad in blue scrubs, approached with an unreadable expression. The pause before he spoke was unbearable. "We were able to stabilize her," the doctor said carefully. "But she's slipped into a coma." The words hit Tristan harder than he expected. He had been bracing for the worst, but somehow this felt just as devastating. A coma. That meant there was no guarantee she'd wake up. No guarantee he'd ever get to tell her how sorry he was. No guarantee he'd ever get the chance to fix what he had broken. His voice came out hollow. "What are her chances?" The doctor exhaled slowly. "It's impossible to say. She's young, which works in her favor, but her body went through a severe shock. The next 24 hours will be critical." Tristan nodded mechanically, though the words barely registered. His throat burned. He turned his gaze toward the doors again, as if sheer will alone could make her wake up. "Can I see her?" The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. Just be prepared, there won't be much change." Nothing could have prepared him for the sight of his daughter lying motionless in that hospital bed. Machines surrounded her, beeping steadily, their rhythms eerily calm compared to the storm raging inside of him. Wires ran across her fragile body, an oxygen tube secured under her nose, and 4 line dripping fluids into her veins. She looked so small, swallowed by the crisp white sheets, so unlike the girl he had convinced himself was just fine. Tristan lowered himself into the chair beside her bed, reaching out hesitantly. His fingers brushed over the back of her hand, and he flinched at how cold she felt. "Emily," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here. I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm here." The only response was the steady, mechanical hum of the machines. A sharp inhale behind him made him turn. Emma Lawson stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes swollen with unshed tears. Tristan vaguely recognized her, Emily's best friend, the one who had always been around when they were younger, though he had never paid much attention. But now, there was nothing childlike about her expression. She looked furious, devastated, exhausted. Tristan rose from his seat, expecting her to crumble, to break down in tears like he had, but instead, she strode toward him, her hands balled into fists. "Where were you?" she demanded, her voice trembling but strong. He blinked at her. "What? Where were you when she needed you?" Her voice cracked, but she pushed forward, stepping closer, refusing to back down. "You don't get to stand here and act like you care now, like this is some tragedy that just happened out of nowhere. I tried to help her, I tried so many times, but she needed you. She needed her dad." Tristan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He wasn't sure what stunned him more, the raw pain in her voice or the truth behind her words. Emma shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "Do you even know how long she's been feeling like this? Do you know how many times she told me she felt invisible? I begged her to talk to you, but she wouldn't, because she didn't think you'd listen." She swiped angrily at her tears. And she was right. Tristan staggered back as if struck. He wanted to defend himself, to tell her she was wrong, but the weight of his guilt crushed him. She wasn't wrong. He hadn't been there. He hadn't seen it. Emma's shoulders sagged, her voice breaking. "She needed you, and you weren't there. And now? Now she might never wake up." The finality of her words hit like a blade to the chest. Tristan turned back to Emily, his gaze sweeping over her still face, her closed eyes, the rise and fall of her chest that was only happening because of the machines keeping her alive. He had spent years convincing himself that as long as she was financially secure, she would be fine. That his absence wasn't a problem because he was giving her everything else. But he had given her nothing. And he might have already run out of time to make it right. Emma's voice softened, barely a whisper. "I don't care what you do with your money. I don't care how many companies you own or how important you think you are. None of it matters to her. She would have traded all of it just to have you look at her like you are right now." Tristan swallowed hard. "I didn't know," he admitted, his voice hoarse. Emma exhaled shakily. "That's the problem." Silence fell between them, the only sound the rhythmic beeping of the machines. Tristan sank back into the chair, gripping Emily's hand as if that alone could tether her to him, could undo everything he had ignored for so long. He had always believed he had all the time in the world. But time was no longer a luxury he could afford. The hospital room was eerily quiet except for the steady beeping of the monitors and the occasional murmur of nurses outside. Tristan sat motionless in the chair beside Emily's bed, his fingers still wrapped around hers, unwilling to let go. Hours had passed since Emma's words had gutted him, leaving him exposed in a way he had never been before. He had spent his entire life shielding himself from failure, controlling every outcome, dictating the terms of his existence. But here, now, he was nothing more than a helpless father, waiting for a daughter who might never wake up. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but he refused to leave. He had spent too many years absent. He wouldn't be absent now. He wouldn't let her wake up alone. If she woke up at all. A soft knock at the door barely registered in his mind. He didn't turn until he felt a presence beside him. A middle-aged nurse stood there, holding a small, worn notebook in her hands. She had kind eyes, but there was something else there too, pity. "I thought you should have this," she said gently, extending the notebook toward him. Tristan frowned. "What is it?" The nurse hesitated. "It's Emily's journal. She brought it with her to every appointment, every checkup, every therapy session. She wrote in it when she was alone." His breath hitched. "Therapy session?" The nurse's expression faltered, as if she realized too late that she had said something he didn't know. "Yes. She's been in therapy for a while now." Tristan swallowed, his throat dry. He had never known. She had never told him. Or maybe she had tried, and he just hadn't been listening. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the journal. It was smaller than he expected, the edges frayed from being thumbed through too many times, the cover a dull blue that looked like it had once been vibrant. His fingers hovered over it, hesitating, as if opening it would be an admission of just how much he had failed her. The nurse gave him a small nod, then left him alone with it. For a long time, Tristan just stared at it. He had never been the kind of person who read personal things. He respected boundaries, privacy. But Emily was in a coma because of him, because of everything he had ignored, and if there was anything in those pages that could tell him why, then he owed it to her to look. With a deep breath, he flipped it open. The first few pages were filled with simple things, lists of books she wanted to read, random doodles in the margins, song lyrics that meant something to her. But as he turned the pages, the handwriting became more hurried, messy, the words darker. "I wonder if he'd notice if I disappeared." Tristan's stomach twisted. His hands clenched around the edges of the journal, his pulse pounding in his ears. He swallowed hard and forced himself to keep reading. "Emma says I should talk to him, but what's the point? He's never here." His vision blurred. He blinked rapidly, but the words didn't change. His daughter, his little girl, had spent God only knew how long feeling invisible, like she didn't matter, like she was screaming into an empty void where her father should have been. He kept reading. Every entry was worse than the last. "I tried to tell him once. I sat at the dinner table for almost an hour, waiting for him to ask how my day was. He never did. I don't think I belong anywhere. Not at school. Not at home. Not anywhere. I just want to stop feeling like this. I don't know if I can do this anymore." Tristan's chest tightened, the pressure unbearable. His grip on the journal was so tight his knuckles turned white, but he couldn't stop now. He had to know, had to understand just how badly he had failed her. Page after page, she poured her heart out in ink, and he had never seen it. He had never seen her. One entry caught his eye, one that looked newer than the others, the ink darker, as if it had been written only days ago. "I wish he would look at me the way he looks at his company. I wish he would care about me the way he cares about his work. I wish I was enough." Tristan sucked in a sharp breath as a strangled sound escaped him. His whole body shook as he pressed his palm over his mouth, trying to stifle the sob that clawed its way up his throat. He had never cried like this before. He had faced failure, loss, betrayal, but nothing had ever shattered him like this. Emily had been right there, all along, waiting for him to see her, and he had been too blind to notice. His gaze drifted back to her still form in the hospital bed, the machines keeping her alive, her face so peaceful it was almost cruel. She looked like she was sleeping, like she could wake up at any second. But there was no guarantee she would. He set the journal down carefully on the edge of the bed, then reached for her hand, holding it tightly between his own. It was so small compared to his, so fragile, and it made him feel impossibly helpless. "I see you now," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Sweetheart, I see you. I swear I do." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a trembling kiss to her fingers. "Please come back to me." The only response was the steady, mechanical hum of the machines. Tristan hadn't left the hospital since the night Emily was admitted. His life, the empire he had built, the world that once revolved around his presence, was on pause. The day after reading her journal, he made the decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He canceled every meeting, every business trip, every speaking engagement. His assistant, his board of directors, even the media scrambled to make sense of it. Investors panicked, speculating about health issues or scandal, but Tristan didn't care. He ignored every email, every call, every demand for an explanation. For the first time in years, his company was no longer his priority. His daughter was. The first few days were the hardest. The weight of his guilt was suffocating, every moment in that hospital room a painful reminder of how badly he had failed her. He stayed by her side, barely sleeping, barely eating, watching over her like if he just held on tightly enough, she wouldn't slip away. Nurses came and went, checking her vitals, adjusting her speaking in hushed voices around him. They were used to seeing grief, to witnessing helpless families beg for miracles. But there was something about Tristan, about the hollow look in his eyes, the way his once unshakable presence now seemed small and broken, that made even the most seasoned nurses pause. He started talking to her on the third day. At first, it felt strange, like an intrusion into the silence that had settled over the room. He wasn't sure what to say. So he started with apologies. "I should have seen you," he whispered, his fingers curled around her hand. "I should have been there. I was so caught up in my world, and I thought giving you everything meant I was doing my job as a father. But I was wrong. I was so wrong." She didn't respond. She never did. But he kept talking anyway. He told her about the first time he held her, the way she had wrapped her tiny fingers around his thumb, and he had never felt anything more terrifying in his life. He told her about the day she lost her first tooth, how she had been convinced the tooth fairy wouldn't come because she dropped it down the sink, how he had spent an hour dismantling the pipes just to find it for her. He told her about the time she made him sit through an entire animated movie about talking animals when she was 7, how she had laughed so hard she nearly fell off the couch. And then he told her the things he had never said before. How much he regretted missing her birthdays, how ashamed he was of every time he had chosen work over her, how scared he was that she might never wake up to hear him say these things. "Please, sweetheart," he murmured against her hand. "Give me a chance to fix this." But the machines kept beeping, steady and indifferent. The days blurred together. He stopped looking at his phone. He stopped thinking about the outside world. The only thing that mattered was Emily, and the unbearable silence of her not answering him. Emma returned on the 5th day. She stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, her expression tight, like she was bracing for a fight. Tristan saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the shadows beneath them. She had been hurting too. "You're still here," she said, not as a question, but as an observation. "I'm not leaving," Tristan replied. Emma let out a slow breath. "Good." Then her jaw tensed. "But what happens when she wakes up?" Tristan frowned. "What do you mean?" Emma crossed her arms, her fingers digging into her sleeves. "Talking to her now won't fix what's broken. She's been alone for years, Tristan. If she wakes up, and I pray to God that she does, you can't just say sorry and expect everything to be fine." Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "She needs more than words. She needs a real father." Tristan inhaled sharply, her words hitting with the same force as before, but this time, he didn't push back. He didn't try to argue or explain himself. Because she was right. "I know," he admitted quietly. "I know I can't fix this overnight. But I'm not going back to the way things were. I swear to you, Emma, I won't fail her again." Emma studied him, her expression unreadable. And then, for the first time, her shoulders loosened just slightly. "She deserves that." Tristan nodded, looking back at Emily. "She does." The vow settled deep within him, anchoring him in a way nothing else ever had. For the first time in his life, Tristan Langley was willing to let go of everything, his company, his reputation, his entire world, if it meant being the father Emily deserved. Now, he just needed her to wake up. Tristan barely left the hospital room. The days had blended into one another, marked only by the soft beeping of machines and the quiet hum of the ventilator. He had lost track of how many sunrises had come and gone since Emily had slipped into unconsciousness, how many sleepless nights he had spent sitting by her bedside, talking to her, begging her to wake up. His world had shrunk down to this room, to the fragile girl in the hospital bed, to the unbearable silence of waiting. The doctors had done their best to temper his expectations. They told him that coma patients were unpredictable. That some woke up in days, some in weeks, some never at all. The damage from the overdose had been extensive, and though they had stabilized her physically, there was no way to know when, if, her mind would return to her. Tristan had listened to their words, nodding blankly, but he refused to accept them. He had spent his life defying odds, overcoming challenges, rewriting the rules of the game. He would not, could not, accept the possibility of losing Emily. So he prayed. It had been years since he had spoken to a God he barely believed in, but in the quiet moments when he was alone with her, he found himself whispering desperate pleas into the void. He promised anything, everything, if only she would come back to him. He would trade his fortune, walk away from his company, disappear from the world entirely if it meant she would open her eyes. He had spent too long blind to the suffering right in front of him, and now that he saw her, truly saw her, he was terrified that she would never see him back. Emma visited every day. She never stayed long, never said much. She simply came, sat in the chair across from him, and watched over Emily with the same quiet devotion that he did. There was no more anger between them, no more accusations. Emma had already said what needed to be said. Now they both waited, bound by the same helpless hope. On the 12th night, Tristan sat slumped in his chair, exhaustion weighing down his body. Emma sat curled up in the chair by the window, her head resting against the wall, her arms wrapped around herself. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Then it happened. It was the smallest movement, so slight that at first, Tristan thought he had imagined it. A twitch, barely perceptible, in Emily's fingers. His breath caught. His heart slammed against his ribs. He sat up, gripping her hand. "Emily?" His voice was hoarse, unsteady. He glanced at Emma, who had jolted upright, her eyes wide with disbelief. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, just as Tristan's heart began to sink again, Emily's fingers twitched once more. And then, finally, impossibly, a weak whisper filled the air. "Dad?" The sound shattered him. Tristan let out a strangled sob, his entire body shaking as he leaned forward.